All right, good afternoon. I'm gonna get going and be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining in. We're gonna be recording this webinar, so I'm gonna mute everyone and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. You'll also follow up to this webinar, you'll get links to a whole bunch of resources that you can download. There'll be a lot of things that I touch on and don't dive into great detail with, and those resources you will get in a follow-up as a set of links. So the reason why I'm doing this webinar today is that we are not only facing one crisis. And first of all, I want to start by saying I hope everyone on this webinar is healthy and managed to keep their sanity. But we're not only facing one crisis, and it's easy in the context of the crisis we are in, this pandemic, to lose sight of the fact that we are in another crisis in terms of climate change and the urgency that we're facing as professionals in the built environment. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in what our daily struggles are and lose sight of the urgency that we need to push things forward. And we're not on track with the 2030 targets, but there are enough people who are and who have institutionalized the capability to do it that I think we're at an inflection point, and building owners are one of the key important levers that can cause acceleration and help the industry propel and move forward at an accelerated rate. So what I want to do today is share things that I've learned, things that I've seen, in an effort to help empower everyone on the call to get to that next level and push things faster and harder. So that's my hope for today. I'm gonna take myself off video for a while, but I just wanted to say hello and put a face to the name, and then I will rejoin video later. Oops. Hold on one second. Strange. So for those of you who don't know me, I have kind of a weird background, social psychology and architecture, recovering architect. I was in mainstream design for 12 years, and then in 1998, I founded the Green Roundtable, which became Sustainable Performance Institute. So I've been working from a nonprofit perspective in the industry for more than 20 years. I've been teaching sustainable real estate development at Brandeis in the International Business School. And I have a unique perspective because I work on both sides of the table. I work with owners of all types, corporate, institutional, hospitality, local government, etc. And I also work within design firms, design, engineering, construction, to help them institutionalize sustainability. So I'm very intimate with the struggles on both sides of the table. There are lots of struggles that are common and some that are unique. So that's what I'm bringing to this presentation today. And you can see the logo soup down in the bottom right is just a representation of different kinds of companies that we've worked with. So for today's flow, it's pretty simple. I want to start first by talking about getting your house in order, because if your house isn't in order, you're going to have a much harder time driving the design firms and design professionals to meet what you expect from them. Next is the all-important hiring the right team, then managing that team effectively, and then the importance of feedback loops and continuous improvement. So it's not a mystery that we are all facing some daunting challenges, but underneath it all, there is a concept that has always been true, which is there are some fundamental dysfunctions in design and the design process that we need to address, which are keeping us back from achieving what we want to achieve. Before I get into keeping your house in order, I just want to share a little framework that I developed a long time ago, observing kind of what makes the difference really between business as usual and what we all aspire to, which is excellence and best-in-class design. it really comes down to 4 things. And if you think about this in the context of energy, I think that's very helpful. Think about mindset in the context of energy 20 years ago. What was the mindset of energy then? It was meet code, make it work. And if you ask the engineers, they also say, don't get sued. So the mindset now is zero carbon, net zero energy. It's a very different mindset. And the importance of that is that that kind of waterfalls into a different process that is needed. You can't have the same linear, disconnected architect designs, then engineer fits their stuff in kind of process. You need a really integrated and collaborative process that is front-loaded, which leads to different tools. Back in the old days, meet code, we had the mindset to meet code, we had the linear process, and we didn't do as much simulation and analysis as we're doing today. And still, we're only about half the way there in terms of projects that report using energy modeling for which it would be appropriate to do. And last but not least, that whole waterfall of a different mindset leading to a different process, leading to different tools, means that we buy different things, especially now with the context of embodied carbon, health, and wellness. So that's kind of a simplified framework, but when you think about it, these are the things that really make the difference. It's not so much money and technology, but the root is definitely in the context of mindset. All right, so getting your house in order. So again, this is important because if you don't have your stuff together, then you're going to have a much harder time driving excellence from the teams that you're hiring and working with. Does your organization have clear goals, and not goals that are on paper on a website somewhere, but goals that people perceive to be real and understand that they're responsible for? Do you have accountability in your organization to ensure consistency to achieve those goals? Do you have silos that make collaboration less effective? And if you're any kind of organization other than perhaps Zappos, which has a very different hierarchy and structure, then you have silos, and that's fine. But the question is, how do you overcome those silos? Do you learn from your portfolio, from the ongoing projects, so that you can put yourselves on a path of continuous improvement and not repeat the same mistakes? And what about turnover? What do you do in post-occupancy? What do you measure? And do you keep teams on past occupancy for 12 to 24 months? So if these things are not checked off and not something that are really institutionalized in your organization, then you have things to address as well. Another mindset thing that I think is really important for property owners, and not just folks who hold property, but also even speculative developers, we need to stop thinking about our assets in a linear manner, that you start a project, a capital project, you design it, build it, operate-ish, and sometimes do energy conservation measures. But instead, you need to start thinking about these assets as an iterative thing, because these assets are things that in most cases you're holding on to for a long period of time. And the life cycle of an asset does not end at turnover, obviously. So that's a mindset approach that also touches on the silo issue, where operations and capital projects and renovation need to be more linked up and more interconnected so that they inform each other. So the first thing that I suggest in terms of getting your house in order is to do your own baseline. Now, the screen cap you see is one that we've created that I'm happy to send to you, and we have an online version of it. You can take it, adapt it, but to do your own baseline, to understand not just do you have goals, but do people perceive, are people aware of them? Do people feel like they're responsible for them? Are they being held accountable? Is your leadership effective? Are key behaviors consistent? Is information being shared effectively? it's good to understand what's working for you and what is creating challenges, because you're going to have to address those challenges. If you have issues, which every organization does, because after all, we're all human, then those issues are going to be impediments. You can't just hire a magnificent rock star team and expect them to do everything despite your own inner dysfunctions. So those things do have to be addressed. And all of the things that that make or break the success of outcomes are typical kind of corporate and organizational aspects of, leadership effectiveness, team, continuous learning, communication, change management. It's really important to understand that these things are kind of the pieces of the engine that make your organization flow or choke. And the level to which you pay attention to these things in your organization is going to be important in terms of how effectively you can achieve your outcomes. So I'm not spending time on this, but I just want to point out that the level of dysfunction in your organization is going to be a hindrance to you. So you do have to pay attention to these things as they relate to project outcomes. So I want to touch for a second on silos, because we all have them to a certain degree, and they may be defined in different ways in different organizations. It may be administration and finance, project management, operations. It may be in a university context, academic, different schools within the institution. Whatever it is, one of the things that's super, super important to overcome the disconnects that can be a result of silos is to have overarching and unifying goals. But those are not enough. You have to have the goals, but if you just have the goals without the other piece of bread in the sandwich, the accountability, then the goals can basically be meaningless, because if no one's held responsible for them, no one's looking to see if people are pursuing the goals, then the goals are all for naught. And most goals these days, certainly in the context of Architecture 2030's work, are related to net zero or zero carbon goals. And those are definitely overarching and unifying goals, because no one silo can achieve those goals by themselves. If you're trying to get to zero carbon and you have 20 different project managers, they are interdependent with each other. Who's achieving what their goals are? Who isn't? How do we pick up the slack? I think it's super important to recognize that this sandwich of goals and accountability are what's going to drive things forward, and one of the key elements to overcoming silos. I think it's important to mention, and again, this is a whole webinar or training in and of itself, but if your organization has never taken change management on as a serious discipline, then that is something that is worth considering. And every organization has change happening on a regular basis, whether it's a new timesheet or whatever it is, from the smallest thing to something big and audacious like a carbon reduction. It's going to require getting people to buy into it, getting them on board, overcoming resistance. So you need to think of change as a design problem. And if your house is not perfectly in order, which most of us it's not, then you're going to be needing to change some things, and those changes will not be met with happiness. People don't love being challenged to change. So think of that and take that also into account. So here are the things that I think are super critical in terms of keeping your house in order. If you don't have a strong culture that empowers staff and allows them to adapt to change, what's eroding that? What's keeping that from being successful? The next, you need to have a vision with unifying, audacious goals that will create interdependence for people to achieve them. You need effective leadership that is perceived as effective, and there's often blind spots. In the work that we've done, we've seen there are often blind spots where executive leadership thinks that it's being clear and effective, and staff don't always perceive that. So it's a matter of organizational emotional intelligence to understand those feedback loops. Accountability, continuous learning, optimizing your process and always challenging the process, having a consistent QA/QC protocol, linking facility management and capital planning. And that it seems obvious, especially after 20 years, but I keep encountering different owner groups who do not do that. So that is, I'd put exclamation points next to that. Having your own internal standards, understanding how to approach change, having a closeout process where you're capturing lessons learned, including collaboration effectiveness, but also building performance strategies, et cetera, and budgeting that looks at invisible losses. So for example, a university, actually two different universities that I'd worked with in the past, their capital budgeting process looked at the cost up until turnover, but then the facility staff would spend 3 to 4 to 6 to 9 months, quote, making the building work. And that investment in man hours and resources was not counted towards the true cost of building. So you need to look at all of the costs and account for them, especially if you're trying to set a really high bar and do things above and beyond what you've normally been doing. The last thing I want to do is make a pitch for this big idea. And I've been talking to a lot of people in the past couple of weeks, lots of different building owners, and I haven't found a ton of precedent out there yet, except for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and cities have definitely been taking on this approach to establishing a carbon budget. And I'm really an advocate for establishing a carbon budget along with your capital plan. And I want you to think about it this way. Imagine if we had the same attitude towards finance as we did towards carbon. No, design team, we don't have a budget. We just want you to keep close track of the money, how it'll be spent, and just try and keep it as low as possible. Doesn't that make your skin crawl? Of course we're not going to do that. So we need to do the same thing, I believe, with carbon as we do with money, because we need the same level of accountability. We can't keep shooting at targets and missing and saying, oh, well, it was too hard, it wasn't possible. We need to bring a little bit more rigor and discipline to it and then achieve more. So I hope I made that point. Carbon budget, think about it, look at it, think about it in the same context as we think about our approach to financial management. And a note for folks who don't flip property, but manage portfolios of property either through leasing or et cetera. Green leases are something you should look at. Institute for Market Transformation, the website up there is the fantastic resource for that. And think of yourselves as pollinators on top of your daily jobs, which are stressful enough. I know I'm loading something else on there, but Biomed Realty is a fantastic example of a building owner developer playing pollinator. They look across their portfolio of lab tenants and they see that some of the lab tenants are drastically reducing their energy demand. And they took it upon themselves to share those lessons amongst the tenants who, of course, don't have a relationship with each other. And that's a fantastic, I think that really was impressive and a fantastic place to leverage that opportunity. Another thing to think of is this ever-evolving workplace of the future, going digital and paperless. One group that I'm working with now is recognizing that that can be a huge challenge. It can require its own budget, but that and the new renewed approach to hoteling and remote working, which now people are much more comfortable with than they were before the pandemic, can all play a part in reducing square foot. And if we reduce square footage, then we're reducing our carbon footprint potentially. It's a question with that. Another thing to think about is neurodiversity in the workplace and designing spaces that are responsive to neurodiversity. So whether that's extreme introverts or people on the spectrum, we can have an objective design aesthetic that says, oh, big, beautiful atriums are wonderful. But in university spaces, I've done some kind of anecdotal interviews, and people who are on a spectrum of neurodiversity don't find those spaces beautiful and appealing. They can find them threatening and distracting. So we need to think about it. And last, and certainly not least, is thinking about passive survivability and operational resilience. So when you're thinking about your capital budget, your planning, your projects that you have on your dashboard, when you're communicating to design teams what you want, you need to also think about how many days of operation does this facility need to have with no power? How long can this facility feel comfortable to its occupants if the power is off? And those are design requirements that need to be identified early upfront to the design team. You can't just throw those halfway through and expect a design team to kind of do an about face and plan for that. And you also need to think within your portfolio, whether it's a local government or university, more likely, is your facility or one of the facilities you're thinking of renovating or designing need to be a shelter in place facility for the larger community or for the campus or whatever. So these are questions that you need to think about before you put out an RFQ or RFP to your design team, which brings us to the part you've been probably waiting for, which is hiring the right team. Now, I think 80% of success potentially lies with hiring the right team. And I've been on both sides of the table, and I'll tell you, 20 years into this, I still see a lot of hand waving and a lot of kind of vague claims that really at this point in time, we should be past that. So how do you set expectations that are going to drive the super performance that you want? How can you see beyond the hand waving and claims that some firms make? What credentials have meaning? And what questions can you ask in an interview situation, and what answers should you look for? And is there a way to evaluate if a firm really has institutionalized best practices so there's no risk of getting stuck with the B or C team? I think these are all critical, and the bad news is, no kids, we are not there yet. We are still struggling with, we're still, sorry, I just checked the chat window, apologies. We're still at a point where the industry is slow to change. We have some rock star firms out there. We have amazing successes, but those do not represent the reality of most firms across the country. So here's a long list of things that I see that still define practice today, and you'll get this slide show, so you don't need to worry about reading every word that's on here. There is still an overdependence on green consultants for more than there should be. I'm not saying that green or sustainability consultants are bad, but I'm saying if that's how if the firm in an interview points to the green consultant as that's how we're going to do it, that's a red flag. Firms who are AIA 2030 signatories, by nature of the program, are addressing these issues. But I have to say, it's true that the firms that I have been working with in the past number of years either have a lack of commitment or they have a commitment that has not resulted in concrete actions. There is no consistent goal setting on projects. A lot of firms are still afraid of pushing the client. Oh, we do what they ask for. We're a service firm. In my mind, that defines a second class or third class firm. If that's the attitude of the firm, then they're not giving the best service. Internally driven best practices, still firms are very reactive. Accountability seems to be a huge allergic reaction within many architecture firms, not all obviously, but many. That's not the same in construction, and engineering is somewhere in the middle. But architects seem to think that accountability is compromises creativity. Again, we'll see examples of the opposite, but it's still too prevalent. So these things, not tracking and learning from past projects, that means that you're buying their past mistakes. If a firm is not actively investing time and effort into learning from the projects that they're designing and are being constructed, then you are essentially buying all the mistakes that they made in the past and you're owning them. So all of these things still define far too many firms in the industry, although not all. And one thing I want to emphasize that I still personally find extremely frustrating is the ever dysfunctional relationship between architects and MEP consultants. It's like a very bad marriage that is not using marriage counseling. There's still a lot of finger pointing, and for the owner perspective, one thing I would say is I would reconsider requiring architecture firms to partner with MEP firms that they have a long history with, because a lot of firms may have a long history with MEP consultants that they're not happy with, that they don't feel can bring the A game. So I would reconsider that, because that puts handcuffs on the process that are unnecessary and don't do you any good. I understand the desire to have these two in a long-term relationship so they know each other, but I don't think you're getting the value for that that you could be. So I think it's important not to require that long history. You want firms that own their relationship with their MEP consultants and who have co-evolved together to understand how to optimize their disciplines and the input between them. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of looking at firms and kind of the hand waving and greenwashing is the myth about integrative design. Now, I can't tell you how many design team selections I've sat in where firms are like, oh yeah, we practice integrative design. And then when you ask them to go into specifics, it's very hard to get specifics. Instead, there's a lot of generalizations or talking about the one-hit wonder design charrette or the lead kickoff charrette or something like that, which is, to me, the kiss of death. A charrette, a workshop is great, but if it's a one-hit wonder, what's the point? One of the most popular workshops we've been doing over the past 5 years is this project delivery methodology workshop, where we work with firms and help them deconstruct how they deliver projects and then align it with the new goals of net zero or zero carbon or LEED Platinum, whatever the goal is that's important to them or to their clients. And the first reason this is important is for owners to see that there are a lot of firms who have done this on their own and are great and they're on a path of continuous improvement, but there are a hell of a lot more who have not. So I'm going to get to this in the interview process, but you want to ask your firms how they've institutionalized sustainability and how their project delivery methodology is aligned with your goals, whatever your stated goals are. It's super important that they can articulate the phases of how they achieve excellence. There's a little firm in San Jose, ABA Architects, I think someone's on the call. They are super with being able to communicate process. And you want your design firms to be able to communicate not just product and beautiful eye candy, but also methodology. So in terms of setting expectations, obviously, after you get your house in order, the first point to focus on are the RFQ and RFPs and the interview process. And there's two scenarios I think are important to keep in mind. One is setting a high bar in RFQs and RFPs, making very explicit, clear goals in that call for proposals. But also, don't forget, you all have ongoing relationships with teams that you have respect for, that you like working with, and maybe they're not all on the bleeding edge, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't be. I think it is very important and well worth the time to engage in engage in discussions with those firms outside of the parameters of an active project, and talk about where you're going, what your expectations are, and how you might work together in the future. I think that is important because it sends a signal, and it's shows that you value the relationship, and B, it can lead to very productive discussions about what the firm might need from you in order to do better, and what you need from the firm. So it's a super productive thing. So in the RFQ and RFP, you need to set aspirationally high goals that are specific, like a target energy use intensity. And I'm going to circle back to that in a second. You need to inspire the team and be prepared to engage with them regularly. I was surprised when I started asking a bunch of friends who are leaders in firms, like, what would you ask of owners to do differently? And one of the things that came up a lot was regularly engaging with them around critical decisions. You can't just leave it to the team and assume that they're going to do the best without you being there to kind of shepherd and bring people back to the point, to the goals that you're trying to achieve. So I think that's an important thing. Again, addressing process and your expectations for collaboration from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint is important. And another thing I hear from firms all the time is, oh, they decided to do lead partway through. Now, I understand that making the decision to invest in lead can take time, especially if you're in an institution or a place where decisions are not agile. But to the extent possible, it's helpful to the team to set those expectations early on, or even if it's unknown, but you think it might be, to put that in their minds. Now, on the other hand, if your team is really an A team and a rock star, the design that they're going to deliver to you is going to be much more in line with lead than if you're working with a firm who does not take excellence seriously. So that's another thing to think about. One example, which may not be a perfect project, but is a perfect example of kind of the importance of setting audacious goals. The Sprague Building in Massachusetts started with an initial stated goal of LEED Silver Plus. Plus is the Massachusetts kind of interpretation of LEED as defined in Massachusetts. So the team was on track to achieve LEED Silver, and that's great, and everyone was happy. But then the goalpost changed. The team wanted to pursue net zero for this project that previously was just pursuing LEED Silver. And the reason I include this case study is because it's hard to find projects that start with a lower level and then decide to be aspirational, and the team can still do it. Luckily, they had a great team, Sasaki, Pierre Placé, et cetera, as you can see here, who were able to do that. And I want to emphasize here that their ability to do that was not solely dependent on a huge solar installation, which did happen, but it was fundamentally based on how they approached the base building systems and building systems integration, which was a huge factor in their ability to achieve the goals. So I don't want you to be shy about setting audacious goals because, oh my gosh, it's not realistic. What can we achieve? If you aim for realistic, you're going to get mediocre. If you aim for audacious, you'll get better than mediocre. And this is another mindset shift that I'm a strong proponent of. I believe that you will get the best bang for your buck if your mindset for the project that you communicate with teams is to start at zero. You want your project to get as close to zero as possible. Then you set an EUI target, energy use intensity target, 27, 54, whatever it is, based on the DDX benchmark, which I'll get to, based on other information, and have that be the ceiling and not the floor. Does that make sense? So instead of saying, we want this project to be incrementally better than code by this much, flip the whole algorithm on its head and say, we want you to get to 0 in parentheses or as close as you can, realizing that 0 may not be achievable, but then your EUI is the ceiling. So you've constricted the design team to look within those parameters, which means in their costing and their initial analysis of the project, 0 carbon or net zero carbon is one of the 3 scenarios that they look at. They should be comparing early on code, net zero, and your EUI ceiling target to look at those different options and see and help you navigate and discuss with them the trade-offs for each of those things. So next I want to get to credentials. So the first and most important one that I'm going to talk about for a bit is the AIA 2030 commitment. If you do nothing else in your RFQ and RFP, the one thing you absolutely must do is put in a requirement or a preference, depending on what you legally can do, for reporting AIA 2030 signatory firms. That's a mouthful if you're not familiar with AIA, which I assume many of you are, hopefully all of you. But Architecture 2030, which is an independent nonprofit, and the AIA partnered, and they've created a program that's been going for a number of years now, where firms self-commit to achieving the 2030 targets, 70% better than code, etc. You can look on the website for all the details of the program. This commitment separates the excellent design firms from those who are just not taking it seriously. At least I have never met a firm that's not part of the 2030 commitment that actually looks at its own performance across a portfolio, measures it, learns, and therefore is not selling you their past mistakes. So if you do nothing else, the one thing I'm going to beg you to do is put AIA 2030 commitment signatory firm as your preference or requirement, or that they are doing the same thing with that the program requires. And if that's the case, then I don't see why they're not signing up. It doesn't cost anything to join the program. There's a lot of support that AIA offers. So I think it's really important to focus on that. ISO 14001 is environmental management system. So this is an indicator also that that a company is taking things seriously in terms of their systems and processes. It's not specific to building performance and their capability to deliver a consistent, high quality service. That is the last one. That's our certification called Smart Sustainability Certification. And that is also, all of these things are aimed at the organization, not the building or people, but the organization. So our certification requires that companies are either AIA 2030 commitment signatories or fulfill the same requirements. And we do third-party verification to evaluate the effectiveness. And if a firm is certified, it means that they have the capability to deliver a consistent, high-quality sustainability service, that you're going to get excellence and not mediocre design. So I want to focus primarily on the AIA 2030 commitment. And from this slide here, which is from the 2018 report from the AIA, the 2019 one is in progress. But even 2018, you can see that there are 16 rockstar firms that were on target, that were hitting 70% or greater energy intensity savings across their entire portfolio. I am sick to death of seeing firms who come in and say, oh, look at our 5 LEED Platinum projects. I want to know about every other project. Don't show me your 5 or 3 or 10. Show me your whole portfolio. How are you dealing with the worst in case building types? What have you learned? What are you doing to improve the bottom? And these firms are a mix of scales and building types, but what's important about this is that it is being done. And if it is being done, it can be done. So as an owner hiring teams, you want the top of the crop. You want the A teams who can, who have realized that taking this seriously means improving their business from the bottom up. It's also not an accident that the last, from 2014 till now, the firms that won the AIA awards were also signatories who had many years of reporting and taking this seriously to improve their practice. So I assume if you're on this webinar that you care about quality and value and excellence. If you don't need to worry about this. But if that's the case, then I wonder, you know, what you're getting for your invested dollars. I also want to emphasize that, given this is also from the AIA by the numbers report, quantifying the impact that these firms have. This bottom line is value. These firms are delivering bottom line financial and more value to their clients. And from my work over the past 20 years and Lance Hosey's report through the AIA, we can both emphasize that this is not about technology and it's not about money, meaning these projects that these firms are doing didn't all have, you know, buckets of cash rain down on them. It's about the human aspect, how they make their commitment, their mindset, their approach, their collaboration, but they're delivering better value to their clients. And I also want to emphasize that AIA 2030 signatories are everywhere. This is just one page from the report. There are 4 or 5 pages of lists of names of firms who have been signatory firms in this program. So the point here is that I don't care where you are in the US and abroad, because many of these firms work all over, Gensler, HOK, et cetera, Cook Fox, they all work all over the world. So no matter where you are, you have the capability of working with an excellent firm. So it's up to you if you want to work with excellent or you want to work with mediocre or below. All right, so RFP, RFQ, use credentials that are important. AIA 2030 is a no-brainer. There's no reason not to do that. Set high targets that are audacious, be very clear in your expectations and goals. And then when you get to the interview process, it's really important to ask probing questions. And there's a document that we've created that I will send as a follow-up, which is a very detailed, more than I have time to get into today, detailed look at a bunch of questions and literally typed out the answers that you should be looking for. So it's definitely a cheat sheet, but hopefully will help you. But things to think about. Bottom line, you want to know, does this firm have what it takes? Are they an A team or a C team? How do I see past the claims? So there's a number of things that you should be asking about. You should be asking about the firm's commitment, and I'm going to give you examples of some of the answers in a second. What is your firm's commitment, and how does it manifest in your work? I don't want to hear just the commitment. I want to hear tangibly, how does that commitment, how has that changed how you work? How has it changed the product that you've delivered? What are examples of operational issues that have informed design decisions? So back to that line versus circle, you want to see that the design team understands that operational issues are not, you know, it's not all about the sexy, award-winning, glossy photo. It's really about a building that has a 25 to 100-year lifespan, and what is that whole lifespan impact of design? What is your approach to healthy materials? What's your design methodology? And I'll get back to that. Another question that has become more and more important is about, how does innovation or R&D play a role in your firm for continuous improvement? Many firms that I've worked with in the last number of years, firm leadership has said, oh no, we don't invest time or money in R&D or innovation. That's a waste of time or money, or we're a service firm or something like that. And I'm going to get back to that, but R&D right now is a sign of intelligence in a firm, I believe. So there are questions, these questions and many others are in the document that I can send you. What you want are very tangible, specific answers to these questions. Again, have they made a real commitment? That could be borne out by Smart Sustainability certification, by AIA 2030 signatory, by the discipline of looking at their portfolio performance. Do they know what EUI is, and do they understand what a high EUI or a low EUI is in the context of the building type that you are hiring them for? Do they know lighting power density and how to calculate it and how to get a lower lighting power density while still maintaining good light quality? Can they be specific about data-driven design? Do they know the performance across their portfolio, and have they seen improvement over time? How do they work with their consultants? What are those relationships like, and how have they aligned them? Are research and innovation part of their culture? And how does the culture drive success? I'll give you examples of that. And leadership and team collaboration. So first of all, one of the dynamics that many firms struggle with is, because of the nature of the business, things change, things go on hold. It's a very dynamic and chaotic process. A lot of times teams are not stable. People get pulled off, pulled on. It's very hard for team leaders to be effective leaders in those contexts and collaborate effectively. A lot of the workshops that we do with firms has to do with leadership development and team effectiveness. It's good to know how they manage the turbulent waters of the chaos of the industry and understand how they maintain quality given those realities. And can they articulate a design methodology? So I'll come back to that in a sec. So first of all, self-awareness and continuous improvement. Again, AIA 2030 signatories tend to have a much higher emotional intelligence because they're making a dedicated effort to understand themselves and feedback loops and improve. I'm going to use examples from Payette, an architecture firm based in Boston, not because they paid me, just because I happen to have more information about Payette than anyone else. So again, I'm using Payette, but that is, that is almost accidental, except that they were the 2019 award winners and they have done a good job at doing these things internally. But here's an example. So in 2008, they did their first kind of big mock-up, which, and this is an important thing, it's not just the actions that they take, but how that then gets integrated into the design firm's culture. So looking at the mock-up, they learned a lot about performance and started considering thermal bridging and building envelope, and that enabled them to make a huge reduction in terms of across their portfolio. But then in 2011, they signed the AIA 2030 commitment and started a building science group, which further led to their reduction across their portfolio in performance. And I think, that's their story. Every firm has a different story, but being able to say, what were the inflection points? How did our practice change and why? That's an important story to hear from a firm. Getting back to my favorite little myth, the myth of integrative design, you want a firm to be able to articulate in their RFQ, what is their methodology? How do they achieve excellence consistently? And this doesn't mean that every project manager does exactly the same thing and is a marionette. Everyone has their own approach and their own style, but the question is, how do you deliver excellence consistently? How do you use energy modeling? When? What's your relationship with your consultants? What happens at the end of a project? What's your closeout process? You need a firm to be able to articulate a methodology about how they achieve excellence. It's just too critical to work. You don't want to work with a firm who has not looked at this and has not kind of aligned their methodology with your goals or their goals. Culture and literacy are super important. Again, example from Payette. How does culture play a role in performance? Well, a lot of the firms that I work with who are, excellent and trying to be even better have one thing that I promote a lot is the EUI wall, the performance wall. Public places in the office where people can post different, the EUI of different projects that are active on the boards. Why is this important? First of all, if it's publicly displayed, it clearly is a value of the firm. It starts discussion. People start having, my dorm is at X EUI and yours is X, times 2. How come? What's the difference? It starts creating dialogue and literacy and understanding in the firm. Another example from Payette, then you start seeing people who are taking it to the next level and, looking in this magazine and then saying, hey, what? This isn't right, and posting that publicly. That is an indicator that it's really starting to be pervasive in the culture. You want firms who can, as I mentioned before, talk in terms of metrics and data when they describe their projects or their approach to things. If a firm is not literate in EUI, LPD, whatever it is, then they're not able to design towards 2 data points that are set by you and by them. And it's not just literacy of their own projects, but understanding how their projects compare in the marketplace. So this is an output of the AIA 2030's DDX platform, which is a database of building performance where everyone inputs the data of their entire portfolio every year. So it gives a huge, and this is something I want to emphasize to owners, you don't have to be an AIA 2030 firm to access the DDX. You can access this DDX and set up an account yourselves. At least last time I checked, you could. So you can go in there, and as you're trying to set EUI for a project in an RFQ or RFP, you can access this database to inform what your decision is. And if it's in your culture and it's in, and you can speak from a data perspective, this is a good example. Payette can say, here's how we achieve better performance. Here are the strategies in labs that we have used to get the lowest EUIs. This is the kind of thing you want to see in a response to an RFP, RFQ, or in an interview. You want them to be able to articulate how they achieve excellence. One is their methodology, how they make their widgets, how they make the frankfurters or whatever the idiom is. But the other thing is, if they've been thorough and rigorous and disciplined, then they're spending time to mine their own data and understand what is it that makes them successful so that they can repeat it and or improve on it. I can't stress that enough. Then back to our dysfunctional marriage between architects and mechanical engineers, although dysfunction is not limited to them. Here's an example of what it could look like. You want your architecture firm to own its relationship with its consultants in whatever way that makes sense for them. In this case, this is an example where Payette had looked at its MEP consultants, and I'm sorry, I apologize if you hear a cat meowing in the background, pandemic days. So here they've looked at their MEP consultants and they've correlated that with their project performance so that they can look and see which MEP consultants have worked on the projects where they've achieved the greatest results and which ones have they worked with that achieve the worst results. That in its own is a discipline to ensure that you're getting better value and quality, because they're not just suffering along with dysfunctional relationships that don't work and then they complain about them. Instead, they're owning the relationships and saying, we expect a higher level of performance, and we're actively trying to figure out how to make that happen. Innovation and R&D. So you want firms that take this seriously. Just think about your healthcare provider. Would you want a doctor that says, nah, I don't keep on top of the most current trends, you know? I would not want that in a healthcare provider, nor should you want that in a design provider. Building technology changes much too rapidly. We're learning a lot very quickly. And again, back to the urgency that we need to really raise the bar on what we're achieving. And we can't do that without innovation. We can't do that without research and development. So again, back to Payette and some examples, it's it's important that they spend, that the firms spend time somehow in R&D and looking at innovation, but more important, it has to link to practice. It can't be 3 people sitting alone in a corner doing research that never gets translated into your projects. So here's an example. Payette is now very well known for their focus on thermal bridging and looking at all of the impacts on that. Sorry. And then from that research, they developed details in their standard detail library, which is another thing that not all architecture firms have, is a standard detail library, or sometimes they have it, it's not maintained. That's another thing that's really important. If you're going to reduce or eliminate thermal bridging, then you have to develop those details, and those details have to be used across the office, not just one team within the office. So they do the research, they develop the details, and then those details actually get put into practice. And that's not even the end of the story. The end of the story is then you have to go back and look at what that means in situ. Like, has it performed, and if not, why, and learning from that and continuous improvement. So I want to pitch another big idea, which is an alternative interviewing process, which is a little different than the usual. The objective of this collaborative interviewing process is to spend or waste less time, get more value, and really experience what it's like working with a firm. So it's a 2-step process. One, individual capability and mindset, and the other is synthesis and collaboration. So in step 1, you get your subject matter experts together, and this is your architect, your engineer, civil, landscape. Depending on your project, it may be a different makeup of people. You want to get them in the room, and first you want to assess their individual capability. So what you do is, first off, they all go into different rooms. And they are asked, and they've already been through, these are your finalists. These are your, say 3 final firms. So they've already gotten enough information about your project. They've been through the RFQ process. They are isolated individually, and they are asked to articulate their approach to your project from their perspective. What's the problem they would solve, and how would they solve it? Step 2 is to come back together, bring back those SMEs together with you, the owner, the owner's representatives, occupant, whoever that group is, and synthesize the different perspectives together. And this gives you this is the dating experience. This gives you a sense of what it's like to work with them. How do they collaborate? How do they collaborate with you? My experience of doing this has shown some kind of wild things. One time, we had a brilliant engineer, and this process was, laid out to them. We had a brilliant engineer, and the architect in the synthesis part of it kept cutting them off and not letting them speak. And the owner got very upset with that. And the engineer ended up being hired for the project, but the architect didn't. And on the flip side, there have been times where the architect has been amazing, and the engineer has just not brought for whatever reason, his or her best thinking. So this process is more streamlined and effective, and it gives you a sense of who you're working with. Managing the team effectively. You need to make sure that your goals and expectations are clear. Your staff needs to have the confidence to challenge the team. You need to have a shared and clear understanding of what the milestones are at each point. And you need to be able to give quick feedback. One of the things that is so common is a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, a lot of people thinking or disgruntled and not expressing it. So what you want is to start your project off with a partnering approach. Partnering was born in construction, and for some reason has not made it past construction that much. I don't see it being used frequently. But the point of partnering, and Bill Ronco wrote a book on partnering that gives sample agendas and other great things, so I highly recommend, is creating teams rather than groups of people, daylighting issues that can cause friction or failure, establishing mutual accountability, and all these things that you need for the team to function at its best, especially if it's pursuing an audacious goal. You also, super important, need to co-create critical path decision roadmaps. So early in the project, whether it's at the initial kickoff or close to it, you need your team to identify what are the critical points to make decisions about energy, water, health, etc. And then how are people going to, what's the sequence of events, whose eyes need to be on what, and that clarifies a lot of the sequencing and flow of what the collaboration needs to be successful. And it needs to happen with the owner and the team together. Another thing another big idea that I want to toss out here is what I like to mimic from the software community, the concept of agile development and the Scrum Master. Agile development in software, it talks about a framework of quick sprints and resolving problems quickly. And the Scrum Master is the person who's keeping an eye on the process. Now, you don't always have this. This is not a project manager. The project manager has a ton of things going on, but it is very valuable to have someone, preferably from the owner's team, but could be on the architect's team, to pay attention to the quality of the collaboration and the process and daylighting issues that are happening that may not come to the surface. The big idea I want to pitch is the agile design process and the sprint, or sometimes it's called the super charrette. This has been done a lot, strangely enough, with golf course design and some other things. But basically it means that you are getting through schematic design in basically a week. I know that may sound crazy, but it has happened, so it can happen. Basically what you need is for the team to prioritize the project. Doesn't mean they can't answer calls or other things. It's a commitment on the owner's behalf of time and resources and front loading the project. It's not necessarily adding money, but it's dedicating time upfront where you can iterate very quickly with all of the disciplines that are important to the decisions in the room, including cost. And this, especially, firms are very validly complaining that schedules are getting compressed, budgets are getting compressed, but there has not yet been a paradigm shift to deal with those constraints. And this is one way to deal with those constraints, is doing this kind of super charrette process. Also making sure that your toolbox is up to date, that your budgeting process includes some of those invisible costs, that you use an OPR, Owner's Project Requirements, which informs the basis of design, and that it's a living document that the team can come back to continuously as they iterate, and post-occupancy evaluation. Now, I am a proponent that you get the most value from your design team if you keep them on 12 to 18 to 24 months after turnover. Firms really want to continue that in the process because occupancy determines performance as much as design does, if not more. So if you don't keep the team together through turnover, then you're losing critical information and understanding. And firms struggle because not every owner is paying for post-occupancy, and they're trying to figure out how to do it on their own. It's an important thing to support. And I want to emphasize my point that I made at the outset. We are at a critical time. We're in a crisis, not just from the pandemic, but in terms of climate and climate change. And the RFP, RFQ, that's a serious signal that you're sending to the marketplace. I'm going to end with a call to action, but I really, really want to encourage you to put strong language to include AIA 2030 signatories or equally strong requirements in your RFPs to send that signal to the marketplace, because we need the firms that are not the leaders to step up. We need them to take this seriously. So the last thing, and I apologize, I'm going over time, the last thing is feedback loops. Do you track your collaboration effectiveness internally and performance across your own portfolio the same way that we want architects to do that? So again, we have we have samples we can send of kind of what you can kind of baseline team evaluations and stuff that we can share with you. But the important thing is that you use feedback loops, you track, not all dashboards have to be this pretty, but that you're tracking key performance metrics that you want to track and using those to inform your projects going forward. That's super critical. So I want to end, and hopefully some of you have a little bit more time for discussion. There are some questions up here. I want to end with a call to action. The owners on this webinar are the ones who have the power to drive the market and get the excellence that we all want from the design firms who have not yet made commitments to excellence. If you're an owner and you're passionate about this, as I am, and you're interested, there's a small group of us at AIA, Code 2030 Working Group, and others who are going to be making some efforts around this. So please let me know if you're interested. And after this webinar, I'm going to send you links to a whole bunch of stuff that goes more into detail. Again, the interview questions and the answers, etc. We have a little bit more time for discussion, and I'll go to the chat now and I'll see what's already been asked. Oops, there are a lot of questions. So one question was, how about a design firm's awareness or sophistication of O&M staff on site who will be responsible for maintaining equipment? The tragedy of specifying a high-tech system that won't be maintained. Oh my gosh. Great question. That's one of the reasons that I mentioned early on. In the interview process, you need to ask them how facilities, operational decisions have influenced their design. You want to see a track record of them seeking out that information and aligning their design approach with what can be maintained. It's absolutely imperative that firms do that. If they can't give examples of that and they've never done it, okay, that's not great. I'd rather have a firm who did, but that just means that you need to make it super clear to them that that is important. And also on the other side, I've definitely encountered firms who have wanted that and not been able to get that from the owner. They haven't been able to get face time with facility staff. So both sides of that, but that is super, super important. Another question, what were the criteria that architect evaluated MEP on? Okay, so I think, and there's more to the question, but it's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head what Payette did. I think that the slide that I was looking at was just the performance of the project. There are more things to evaluate MEP on, and I think one way to do one thing I recommend is architects always have a range of MEP consultants, the cream of the crop, and they're always asking me to recommend firms in Canada. I don't know why. But you take your cream of the crop MEP and you use that relationship to understand what is it that makes them so great. What is it? It's, there are some fundamental things like responsiveness and quality of the product that they're giving you, but there's also what they're advocating for and how they're executing their work and what they spend time on. I think it is important to establish that, and I can give you more information offline and follow up from that. Let's see. You must get asked all the time about strategies to encourage owners to either do post-occupancy surveys or allow the design team access to them. Yeah, absolutely. So many architects want to do post-occupancy evaluations, and they claim that the owners it's not part of the scope, they're not allowing it, they don't have time. Owners, I think it's critical. If you are not doing some level of post-occupancy evaluation, you're leaving money on the table, certainly for your next project, whether it's capital project or renovation. I think it's critical that you do that. I recommend that you keep the team engaged to be part of that. You can certainly do it on your own, but I think it's much more meaningful and valuable if you do it with the team, both because of accountability and their learning and understanding, and also yours. You always predict what the occupancy will be, and pretty much 9 times out of 10, occupant behavior is not what you predict. So that's part of the equation. But I think it's really important to focus on that. Voluntary carbon accounting is incredibly important, and what we must do now as much as we can. But the mandate for carbon accounting, I guess there is no mandate. Yeah, so so there isn't a mandate for carbon accounting or a carbon budget. But the codes in Massachusetts, we just have the draft of an easy code proposed, an Energy Zero code. Codes are changing and the bar is raising. But here's the thing, being an owner, this is the point, the whole point maybe of this webinar is you guys are the owners. You don't have to wait for a mandate, for a legal mandate. You can set your bar where you need to. In most cases, I'm sure there are exceptions, but this is the opportunity. You know, at this point, we can't rely on a federal government to set carbon reduction goals. State governments are taking a lead, that's fantastic, but really, you guys are where the action is. You set a carbon budget and you look at your own portfolio. ULI's Greenprint Foundation has a group of developers and owners who have made that commitment. I don't know if they've made carbon budgets, but if I leave you with two things, it's A, use AIA signatories as a preferred or requirement in your RFPs, and B, consider a carbon budget seriously, because it's the same as the point I made before with money. If you don't set a financial budget, you certainly won't hit it. If you don't set a carbon budget, how do you even know if you're hitting it? So those are all the questions that that I've gotten now, and I am time, but I've unmuted everyone. If anyone has any other questions. No? Fantastic. So we'll meet you all again because it's noisy. So thank you all for attending the webinar today. I hope it was useful. I will send all the resources that I promised, and feel free, if I didn't address something or you want to dive more in depth, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to follow up. And please, please, my call to action to help play your part in the market transformation that we need by sending the signal to the design community that you want the excellent design firms and you expect a level of excellence and all that that means, because that will help us, that will be the one lever that will be most transformative for all of us. Thanks again, and I hope you're all healthy and keeping safe, and good luck with everything that you're doing. Have a good day.